fact that something cannot be easily defined doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Or the fact that people have difficulty in understanding what it is just because they can't define it. So I have written about this extensively myself. Hinduism is an example of a type of system called complex adaptive system. Now, complex adaptive systems describe all kinds of things, phenomena, for example, like weather systems, languages like English, for example, evolving languages, not Sanskrit, but an evolving language like English. It describes cities, financial markets, and so on. And one of the classic problems of complex adaptive systems is the problem of definition. Let's say, after all, if I ask you to define the English language, you will go around in as many circles as you will be when you define Hinduism. That doesn't mean English language doesn't exist. Not even the most elaborate description of all the words in English and all the grammatical uses of English will allow you to define English. It's almost impossible to define it. Just like it's almost impossible to define the city of Delhi. Ultimately you'll have to define it using some administrative or some such thing. But in fact, the city of Delhi is many things. You can combine it with Gurgaon to Noida as an urban system. You can think of the city of Delhi in historical terms or the administrative terms. Frankly, it's a waste of time at one level, because the fact that we understand this English language or the city of Delhi is not dependent on being able to define it. So in the same way, Hindus know when they see Hinduism. Our inability to define it doesn't somehow mean that it doesn't exist or that it's not a useful concept. This is also true, consequently, of Hindutva. I wanted to make this point. And it is important that even the idea of India as a nation very often comes up, and we have this long debates about the idea of India and so on. But in fact, India is many things simultaneously, and why not? India is the nation state with the borders that we have. India is also a geographical concept. India is also a civilizational concept. All of these have simultaneously exist. And it is there in our constitution for exactly this reason, stated right in the beginning as India, that is Bharat. The statement here is not India and then Bharat being just the Hindi translation of it. Otherwise, all that would have been done would have been when we wrote the constitution, the Hindi version would use Bharat and the English version would use India, and that would be the end of the matter. That's not the case. The English version says India, that is Bharat, suggesting that the nation state of India has some link to this other concepts of India, particularly the civilizational concept, presumably represented by the word Bharat. So this fuzziness, I think we should be comfortable with. The fact that Western scholars find it difficult to define is their problem. Now, comes to the book itself, which I think is nice because it is a history. And history, which goes, of course, to the beginning, goes through. The beginning part of it is a little more about the religion of Hinduism rather than its consciousness. But I think, frankly, you could have been a little bit more gone out and spent a little bit more time about the fact that actually Hindus have had a sense of Hindutva from the very, very beginning, and for a very, very long time. Even, in fact, you have, right in the Puranic texts mentioned, south of the snowy mountains but north of the deep seas, there live the descendants of Bharat. So it is right in the beginning, hundreds of years ago, clearly thinking about there being a conception of a people who live in this geographical space. And other people outside the country also have recognized this. You talked about, of course, the Persian and Arab use of the term Hindu. But in fact, this term is a very, very old term, older than you thought. Because the first use of a geographical term in the Rig Veda is the Sapta Sindhu, which, in my view, and I have talked about it, is pre-Harappan. The likelihood is that the Rig Veda at least predates 3000 BC because it clearly mentions the Saraswati river as flowing, and we know for a fact now that by 3000 BC, i.e. before the large Harappan cities were built, the Saraswati had dried up. So consequently, the Rig Veda must predate the mature Harappan phase. That probably relates to the early Harappan phase. Now, This term, Hapta Hindu, which is a geographical term, in the Rig Veda itself, relates to the area that we know roughly now as Haryana and Eastern Punjab. It is not Punjab, as is very often used loosely by people. The Sapta Sindhu relates to the Saraswati and its own tributaries, not to the 5 rivers of the Punjab. That is completely clear if you read the Rig Veda. Now, this term, geographical term of Hapta Hindu, then spreads over time as the Vedic text becomes like a unifying, underlying operating system of the rest of the country. And so what you see later on, many centuries later, you have this chant about the 7 rivers, and a chant includes the Narmada, it includes the Kaveri and so on. So you can see that the conception of Sapta Sindhu starts with maybe Haryana and its neighborhood and then spreads. And the Vedic template then becomes the underlying operating system on which the rest of Hinduism is then built. So this term is therefore as important as a geographical term, but also as a civilizational term, because later on it becomes a civilizational term. But is it interesting that this term, Sapta Sindhu, is echoed in, of course, these Zoroastrian texts, where they do mention the Hapta Hindu. And they mention the Hapta Hindu as a somewhat, it's not very clear what they mean by it, but possibly as an original homeland. And at the very least, they seem to be aware of this land of the Hapta Hindu. So, this term Hapta Hindu, consequently, since the Zoroastrian Gathas are around about the same age as the Rig Veda, since they use the same, roughly the same language, they're basically dialects of each other. It would say that at least by 3000 BC, Eastern Iranians were aware of the geographical term of Hindu, of the 7 rivers, Hapta Hindu. Now, this comes to the issue of then, to what extent was this not merely a general cosmological or cultural idea, but also social and political idea. And even there, you can clearly see a very strong consciousness of being a civilizational nation from a very early stage. And it's not even unique to us. People talk about India had all these small kingdoms that were fighting each other and didn't have a consciousness. Utter rubbish. The Greeks were also fighting each other. Sparta was fighting with Athens, Athens was fighting with Corinth. But every time the Persians turned up, they were very clear about them being united. They used to hold the Olympic Games every few years in which the Persians weren't invited. Right? So they clearly had a sense of a certain cultural or nationhood. That is also true of the Indians. After all, the first Indian empire, the Mauryas, was built consciously in opposition to this Greek invasion. And you see that happening with the Guptas as well. The Gupta Empire was consciously built in opposition to the Hun invasions. And there's a term which we use for people who are not from within the civilizational space, which is the term Mleccha. Those who are outside the civilizational space. Now what is interesting about the use of this term is that the term is never used for people like, for example, Southeast Asians, the Naga people of Southeast Asia. Right? They are never used for the Sri Lankans. Why not? Because they are within the civilization. So consequently, there is an understanding of ourselves of Hindutva, those who are within the civilization. And for a long period, at least of the early medieval period, that Southeast Asia was considered it. It's quite interesting. You never hear the term Mleccha used for those them, suggesting a very clear understanding of the term of a certain internalized idea of Hindutva. Maybe the term itself was not used, but certainly the idea existed. You see that also with the rise of the Vijayanagar Empire. The Vijayanagar Empire was self-consciously created at the end of the Turkic invasions by Malik Kafur. It was consciously a revivalist empire. And so, again, clearly an idea of resistance against invasion. And you see that also, of course, with the rise of the Marathas. The Marathas were conscious of the fact that they were trying to re-establish a certain civilizational backed empire. And you have the term Hindavi Swaraj being used very consciously. So this idea that somehow this is a 19th century nationalism that we somehow got from the West and imbibed it is utter rubbish. There is more than adequate evidence that we really knew. So, for example, when Sri Aurobindo is building out his idea of nationalism, and by the way, very much derived from Hindutva, so to speak, he doesn't. Where does he begin to look to start it? And it's quite interesting. His brother, Barin Ghosh, goes looking to set up a monastic order, and interestingly, they tried to set it up in Maharashtra first, in a Bhavani temple, as a Bhavani temple. Why? Because they were trying to create a direct link to Shivaji. Same thing happens with Tilak. So there is a continuity, and that they are trying to continuously establish back to this conception of Indianness. So similarly, of course, the same idea, of course, is there very much in Shankaracharya. Never mind his philosophical context, which is not, your point is about Hindutva. He doesn't build his mutts in a random distribution. One is in the north, one is in the south, one is in the east, one is in the west. It is a clear geographical conception of a space. And of course, Diana Eck has very famously written about how the landscape of India is united by pilgrimages. Or, for example, the Shakti Pithas. So, there is a clear conception of a geography, a certain kind of nationhood, which is linked to that geography. But it's not, they are not completely overlapping, because as I mentioned, there were periods of time where, say, Southeast Asia was considered a part of that space. And now, when we are dealing with a diaspora of Hindus living all over the world, we may have to rethink it. We may have of course, many Hindus who are not of Indic origin, and they're not just new converts. They too are there, but you also have Balinese and still Vietnamese Hindus who still exist, who are not Indians. This is not even their Matribhumi in that sense, but there is a sense of a holy land. I'll give you one example. If you go to, I actually spent some time with Vietnamese Chams, there is about 30,000 of them who still practice Hinduism. And their legend is that when they die, Nandi comes and takes their soul to Jambu Dvipa, which is another word for Bharat. So there is a conception still of a holy land, but that doesn't mean it's a Matribhumi or Pitribhumi. But there is this conception of a holy land still that exists very much there of our sacred geography. And of course, as we get new converts into Hinduism in other parts of the world, we have to also think that Hindutva may not exactly coincide with the Republic of India, although they will continue to have links to it. But that does not mean that Hindutva as a concept is either invalid or does not exist. Just a few things more. I liked a couple of things that we did in this book, which was to bring out lesser known characters or facets which are very often forgotten in the discourse. I like the fact that we brought back, say, a character like Balraj Madhok. Very important character in the history of Hindutva, and still has enormous influence on the way we think about this concept, but unfortunately lost because politically he lost, but I think in some ways intellectually he won. Between you and me, between integral Hinduism and the writings of Balraj Madhok, I am quite clear that Balraj Madhok's writings are far superior. Integral Hinduism, I think, is a dead end intellectually. I mean, you can disagree with some of Balraj Madhok's views on, in my view at least, excessive interest in Hindi, which as a Bengali, I look at Hindi as a language, I have an interest in it, I speak it fluently, but I wouldn't link the future of Hindutva to it. But on the other hand, many of his other ideas I find quite attractive. But I think his ideas have a future with some adaptation. Integral humanism, I'm afraid, is a dead end. Just some comments on Professor Jha, which I wanted to say, but I have some differences of opinion on. I actually prefer Rajesh's approach to creating these distinct periods and evolution and sort of separating them out. Partly because I think there is a difference between the Vedic Samhitas as in Shruti and the later Upanishads, both in time and conception. And it depends, of course, on which stream of Hinduism you come from. I come from a stream of Hinduism where we do not consider the Upanishads as being part of the Vedas at all. or being in fact be considered as a Shruti. So we consider that you can write new Upanishads, but you cannot write new Vedas. So conceptually, therefore, I actually disagree completely with your view on that. I am in fact an advocate of writing new Upanishads, whereas I do not obviously think you can write new Vedas quite easily. So I quite have a different view on that, and I also do not think that Vedantic Hinduism is the only form of Hinduism that exists. There are many other Agamic Hinduisms, Puranic Hinduisms, and myself being an Agamic, I do not, although I would say I have respect for the Vedantic thought, but I do not derive my Hinduism at all from Vedantics, at all. But on the other hand, clearly link to the Rigvedic ideas. So I would say that there are many Hinduisms here as well, and not everybody would agree with that conception. I actually prefer Rajesh's approach that these were, while linked in a chain, but these are, each link is a different piece, even though they are linked together. So with that, let me stop.
Great. So many Hindus